Hi everyone, welcome to the Communication and Conflict YouTube channel promoting mindful communication and growth through conflict, and this is also a podcast under the name CAOS, C-A-O-S. So what I want to talk about today is more about the idea of psychological safety at work, and if you've seen some of my other videos on this, how for me there are so many similarities to what mediation as a process is designed to support and what's described as psychological safety. Conflict coaching practice as well also very much aligns with the kind of aim and thinking of psychological safety. So what I want to do today is go through the ways in which I see that as kind of showing up in mediation practice. So what I want to do is kind of, first of all, give two particular kind of examples of how psychological safety at work is characterized, and then go through mediation skills and practices and conflict coaching skills and practices that I genuinely believe support that very aim of achieving or creating a sense of psychological safety in a workplace. So the first characterisation is the one which is been put out by the person who is pretty much the pioneer of the concept of psychological safety, i.e. Professor Amy Edmondson. And her description of psychological safety is that it's a belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. So that's her kind of very simple but quite powerful description of what constitutes psychological safety as she sees it. And as I say, she's very much the person who's the kind of the focus of the whole kind of concept and the idea of it, and has written books about it and has given various kind of interviews on YouTube and other places, and podcasts. And I think what I like about what she's saying is it's kind of very easily summarized. It's not full of kind of technical jargon. It's just saying it's a belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. So it creates an environment where people feel safe to express themselves, basically, and to create, which is what you want in teams, if you want in your work environment, etc. So very nice, simple kind of description of it. Another description I've seen, which is by somebody called Timothy Clark, who's the CEO of Leader Factor, and he's written a book called The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety. And his description of the 4 stages are inclusion safety, so that people feel included in their team, in their department, in their workspace. Learner safety, so people feel safe to learn and grow within that environment. Contributor safety, so people feel able to contribute to discussions rather than just simply, nod agreement, perhaps, as sometimes can be expected in meetings and in discussions, particularly if the boss is there. Do you think my idea is a great idea? Oh, yes, boss, that kind of thing, rather than, well, actually, I can see some difficulties down the line, being able to say those kinds of things. And challenger safety, so feel safe to challenge the status quo. So when things perhaps need to move on and change and develop, there's a safety about raising that as a viewpoint, as a concern, as a suggestion, as an idea. So hopefully you can see that both of those characterizations are very similar in their kind of aims and their ethos and their thinking. So what I want to do now is kind of outline how I see the use of and practice of mediation skills as being almost entirely aligned with that. There's so much about what I'm seeing about psychological safety at work as being supported through the kinds of practices that mediators use. I suppose I need to give a bit of a caveat because as any of you have come across mediation might know, there are various approaches or even understandings of what mediation is. So I can only speak about the model that we use at CAOS and that we train people in, although I would say there's quite a lot of commonality between our model and many models that are described as facilitative, whereas you do get some models of mediation which are more evaluative, and for me they're much more like arbitration, where the mediator is still giving a view, the mediator is still trying to influence the outcome. But the approach that we use and that we train people in at CAOS Conflict Management it's very much one that kind of trusts that people know far better than anybody else what's going on for them and what their concerns are, and that given space to be able to express those concerns, they're the ones who are more capable of creating the best outcomes for themselves than somebody coming in from the outside, having a brief understanding of what's going on and trying to give a fix. So this is why I would say this kind of model of mediation very much supports the idea that where there are difficulties or there are wishes to have what might feel like a difficult conversation about things, mediation practice supports that being possible. And while I wouldn't say that leaders or others within a team they won't be acting as mediators, their understanding of the thinking behind mediation practice will enable them to see ways in which they can move on to fulfill those kind of characterisations of psychological safety that Timothy Clark and Amy Edmondson have outlined. So just very simply, what I always say to people when we train them is mediation is very much a simple process. The more simple it is, the more powerful it is, because the more complex things become as a process, the harder it is for people to kind of engage with it. But there's three very simple things that a mediator does, which is to listen, to summarise, and to question. So it is very simple as a process, but what I also say to people when we train them in mediation skills is that doesn't mean to say it's easy to do. It's very personally challenging to look at our own kind of inclinations, our own wishes, our own kind of judgments, and how that can then influence whether we're able to listen, summarise and question effectively in the way that a mediator needs to. So I'll go through some of the ways in which I believe those three skills support psychological safety, and hopefully that will come across to you as to the ways in which I mean that to be so. So listening, first of all, when I listen, can I be aware that I've got other things going on in my head? Because I'm a human being, that's always going to be happening. So to what extent can I kind of acknowledge that and kind of keep my focus on what the person I'm listening to is saying, if I'm there as the leader? And having listened to them, can I summarise back to them using their words? So I summarise back to people using their words. Now, sometimes people say, oh, no, that's not what you do. You're supposed to reframe it, or you're supposed to say it back in your words. But the problem with that is that if we're wanting to create an inclusive, contributor safety, an inclusion safety and a contributor safety environment, and one where people feel it's okay to speak up, if I'm the leader, or actually if I'm any member of the team, if I'm the leader and someone says something to me and I reframe it in my words and say it back to them, it's as if I'm saying, no, you've said it wrong. You're supposed to say it my way. And so it's very easy for people to feel, well, that's not what I said, so you're obviously not listening to me, or you're kind of changing what I've said here. Because even though we might think we're saying back to them what they've said but using our words, it's very possible that they won't see it that way, that they will see us as simply changing what they've said to fit our wishes for how things should be said. So one of the most powerful things for people to experience is for them to have their words said back to them. So first of all, it's confirming they've genuinely been listened to, because you can't say it back to people if that what they've said if you haven't listened to them. But it's also, in a sense, valuing that that's how they say it, that that's their perspective, that they're not having to hear my version of their perspective said back to them, and that perhaps, that doesn't seem like it's valuing their way of saying things. And that can be very difficult for people, because people will often want to initially change it to how they want to see it. But that's kind of missing the point of what a psychologically safe environment is, which is one where people can express their own views, and they're going to be accepted and considered and reviewed. Now, obviously, a leader isn't going to be trained to be a mediator, but to be aware of that practice, it doesn't mean to say that there can't be more exploration of what the person has said later. But initially, one of the most powerful things you can do is to say back to people what they've said in their words, so that they get a chance to hear themselves. Others present maybe also get a chance to hear what they've said a second time. It values that they've said it. It acknowledges that that is genuinely their view, and it's giving space to them to say their point of view. As I say, if you change it, or if you don't give a summary, is another thing that can happen sometimes, that people don't actually hear a summary back, so they don't really even know if they've been heard at all. But if they do hear something back and it's in their words, it gives so much more kind of value to the fact that they've said it. And if you adopt that practice with everybody, it means there is no kind of hierarchy of viewpoints. It means that everybody is included, and that their views are considered and valued, and certainly that no one's going to be punished or humiliated for speaking up, because it's first of all just acknowledged or witnessed is the way that I like to describe it. Their viewpoint is witnessed and heard without anybody jumping in or changing it or responding more with an opinion or a correction or an answer. The first and most important thing is that what the person has said is witnessed and reflected back to them. And what we always say on the training is that you don't have to reflect back everything that the person said, but to ensure that what you do say back to them is in their words, so that their way of saying it is being acknowledged. There's so much I could say. I'm not going to do a mediation training course in this video, but that being the thinking behind listening and summarising. So the questioning, Amy Edmondson particularly has said a lot about the power of questions, and one description she's used, which I would see as very relevant to mediation practice as well, is can questions be asked to which we don't think we already know the answer. So we ask a question not knowing what the answer is going to be. So again, I would ask you to consider how often it is the case that the questions you ask are not expecting a particular answer. So therefore, again, if you're the leader, but it doesn't have to be the leader, anybody in the team, if you're asking a question thinking you already know the answer, you're not really remaining open to others' expressions of their idea. And if they don't answer in the way you expect, does that mean to say then you've got to try to kind of steer them back to the answer that you're expecting? Whereas if you ask an open question, and it's genuinely open, it doesn't have any knowledge of what the answer is, because it's genuinely curious about another person's point of view and accepting of the possibility that it may not fit your perception. Now, as a mediator, that's crucial, because I'm not there to have any view about people's ideas. I'm there to help them to express them to each other. But as a leader, you're already going to have perhaps your own ideas about what's necessary or what the ways forward are. But the point of a psychologically safe environment is you're open to hearing that you may not be aware of the whole story. So to invite questions, through questions, other people's opinions and viewpoints and to be able to do so without thinking that you already know the answer is one that is genuinely supporting contributor safety, as Timothy Clark describes, inclusion safety, challenger safety, because people might say something which is challenging of what you've assumed to be so, challenging the status quo. And it's also very clear that it's not seeking to punish or humiliate people for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes, because you're actively seeking them, you're actively asking for them. But in a way, that's only going to be an effective question if you do go into it without thinking you already know the answer. So again, that's a challenging, personally challenging thing to be able to do. It's probably one of the most challenging things that any mediator needs to learn how to do, because often we will already have our preconceptions about things. We will already have our perspective on things. So to be able to ask a question that acknowledges that our perspective is not the only one, or that our perceived answer to a situation is not the only one, can sometimes be quite hard to let go of. So the use of open questions as a mediation skill is very powerful in supporting that psychological safety. And one of the other things that I would say that, in a sense, perhaps is more likely to come from having been a mediator, although obviously some people just personally might feel less challenged by this than others, but to be able to accept fully the possibility of disagreement. In a way, as a mediator, I go into any mediation, fully expecting disagreement. There wouldn't be a call for mediation if there wasn't disagreement. So because of my role, I'm used to being on the other end of the spectrum of kind of comfort or discomfort with disagreement. I expect disagreement. That's what I'm there for, in acknowledgement that there is disagreement. But for whatever reason, usually with mediation, that disagreement has led to some kind of relationship breakdown in some way. But obviously in a team, a leader it may not be that there's clear disagreements about things, and particularly in any kind of relationship breakdown kind of way. But when that disagreement arises through asking open questions, through hearing other people's points of view, how comfortable does a leader feel, does a team member feel with the fact that that disagreement has arisen? Because obviously sometimes people can find that quite difficult because, again, it is challenging the status quo. So what they thought was nice and comfortable and steady is being challenged or questioned or disagreed with in some way. So those kind of personal challenges that very much you have to address as a mediator, I think are very important for any training of people kind of wanting to create an environment of that supports psychological safety at work. It's very important that any training gives people a chance to explore that for themselves on an experiential basis. Also, Amy Edmondson particularly, I've heard a lot speak about, but I'm pretty sure Timothy Clark as well will speak of this, the idea of mistakes and failure being okay. Now, again, as a mediator, I kind of almost expect that's inevitable in any discussion, that people will see there as having been mistakes and failures. But that's because I'm going into something which is beyond just the facilitation of a team. It's going into a situation where there's known to be a relationship breakdown of some kind. But for leaders, how comfortable are they going to be, and are team members going to feel? How comfortable are they going to feel about being able to discuss mistakes and failures? And again, I would say that these practices of listening, summarising and questioning support that being possible, even if internally people are still feeling uncomfortable about them. The uses of these skills that I've described, which are very much reflected in mediation practice, support that being possible, because it's not shutting down viewpoints, it's allowing them. It's not punishing or humiliating people for having those viewpoints. It's open to them. But I think, there needs to be quite a lot of consideration for what the personal experience is of both trying to be a leader to support psychological safety in your team, in the workplace, but also to acknowledge that those difficulties are also experienced by the rest of the team. So this is why, for me, when we train mediators, it's always an experiential training. You can't kind of just sit down and say to people, do this, do this, do this, and that's it, you're a mediator. You've got to give people a chance to go through the challenges of actually doing these practices to see what comes up for them in coming to terms with the fact that people disagree with things, and instead of trying to kind of placate it and keep it all calm, to actually support it being expressed, but in a way which is constructive and useful, rather than abusive and destructive or disrespectful, or for people to shut down and be quiet. So, as I say, I wanted to just kind of outline how I see mediation skills promoting psychological safety at work, and to give an insight, hopefully, that you might find useful about what the actual skills of mediation practice are, such that they do and are able to support what seems to be the characterisations of psychological safety by two particular kind of pioneers in that field. So yeah, hope you found it interesting, hope you found it useful. Let me know what your thoughts are. Have a good day. Bye bye.